from the other class on this. Oh, I forgot to pause it. Oh well, all that is in preserved. Yeah, really. I could stop it now and send it up and restart one, but it's there. It's there. At any rate, but I don't know if you all know this, but you can print out PowerPoints in what's called outline mode. In the printing options, you can choose how many slides you want to a page, or you can just choose outline mode. And outline mode gives you all of the text and nothing else. So say if it were a long PowerPoint, and I do have some long ones, not this one, but that say took 17 or 18 pages to print out in 3-slide mode, it might take 2 or 3, and you'd get all of the information, So, it's one thing to think about if you like to print something, and basically don't want to do the whole thing. Now, I will tell you, in better years when we had more of a budget and I used to do printouts for students, I would always do the 3-slide mode because it gives you 3 slides on the left and then lines to take notes on the right. And if you're printing them out for yourself, that's a mode I would recommend. You don't get it takes more pages, but you can make notes as you go. Okay, well, I know a lot of you already know that, but in case somebody doesn't or has forgotten it. So virtue ethics is about virtuous character traits. And as I said, one reason why I wanted to do this is that ethicists today still think that Aristotle said a lot of things that are relevant. Aristotle also talks, besides moral virtue, which is what we're going to talk about, he talks about perfecting in ourselves intellectual virtues that deal with theoretical knowledge, and things like scientific knowledge or knowledge of math or something. We're not going to worry about that. We're going to sort of focus on what he calls moral virtues, and so Aristotle thinks we can acquire these moral virtues in the same way we acquire a skill at playing a musical instrument. That is, by habitually practicing and performing things. Aristotle is very practical on that. But very often we have to develop habits, like if you're trying to develop self-control or trying to develop courage, you have to kind of work against what your natural tendencies are. Both Plato and Aristotle and Socrates thought that we have a kind of lower part of our nature that's mostly concerned with our basic appetites for food, drink, and, yes, sex. And that, that might lead us in one direction, but if we're trying to develop a virtue, we might have to fight against our tendencies, say to have that second piece of pie or whatever, if you're trying to develop temperance. So he actually thinks we acquire them by learning. We learn to build by building. I am, in the most literal sense of the word, a baby boomer from the World War II baby boom. My parents got married in 1946, right after that war, and my brother and I came along a few years later. And the point is, my dad was doing some things like house painting and all, and It was really bothering his asthma. And my mother convinced him to go back to school on the World War II GI Bill and learn a trade, a different trade, because the painting he wasn't doing, so good at. It was bothering his lungs. And so he learned carpentry, which he practiced most of his life. But, I have some things that he built when he was in carpentry school. In other words, these are learned skills, so we learn a skill like carpentry by building. We learn to play a musical instrument like a lyre, L-Y-R-E, similar to a harp. And so, now Aristotle, some people misunderstand Aristotle's point here, and I get essays that lose some points because they misunderstand Aristotle. Aristotle is not saying by learning to play a musical instrument you can develop other character traits, Now, people who are arguing for music in public schools and all do say that there are side benefits to learning to play an instrument that go beyond just the skills you acquire in playing the instrument. But Aristotle might have agreed with that, but that's not his point here. What he's saying is not that you learn virtuous character traits by learning to play a musical instrument, but he's saying that learning virtuous character traits is the same type of process as you use to learn a musical instrument. That is, practice over time. It isn't like, you're a scoundrel one day and then the next day, you're a totally honest person. But he thinks that these are developed. Now, Aristotle's very practical. For Plato, the standard of moral goodness is an abstract form, goodness itself, or the form of the good with a capital G. And so that's what sets the bar at its highest point for ethical and moral goodness for Plato. Now, for Aristotle, forms do not exist independently of particular things. And so if he thinks that across the board, it means that there's no independently existing form of the good to be used as the basis for ethics. Aristotle is much more practical, and we'll see that he thinks the end of ethics is a happier life here and now. So we don't develop these virtuous character traits in isolation. It's not a matter of getting alone by ourselves and meditating on courage or self-control, but he thinks we develop these in the real world, in our actual interactions with people. So we become morally just by performing just acts in our transactions with other human beings, in community, and not in isolation. Now this is a very important point. This is kind of the model for Aristotle of a basic virtue. And the Greek society viewed moderation as virtuous. Aristotle was trying to give a more technical, philosophical view, but the Greeks called this the golden mean. In other words, that very often the best life for them is a life of moderation, and so a virtue for Aristotle is following the midway point between what are, for him, two vices: a vice of excess and a vice of deprivation. And the virtue is located in the middle. Now, like I say, we are not taught necessarily to believe that. I mean, for some people, the happiest life is one where you go to total extremes, but not for Aristotle. So, an example of a virtue is self-control or temperance. And Aristotle knows that we have a human nature and that as human beings we need, food and drink to survive, right? But, so, he's not recommending as virtuous a life where you live in denial of all the needs of your body, right? We call this an ascetic life, like some mystics, claim to be able to live on just air. They don't even eat food, right? For Aristotle, that's not the virtuous life. That's a vice of deprivation. But then, of course, overindulgence, gluttony, or in the case of drink, I'm drawing a mental blank. At any rate, having too much is also for him a vice. So temperance is learning to control our impulses, and not having too much or too little of something. And we're going to see that he believes that it's our reasoning abilities that allow us to kind of take control of our lives and walk this middle ground. Another example he gives is courage. I had a Greek professor in college. He wasn't Greek, but I took Greek as one of my languages in college. And back then, I mean, when I went to college in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of my professors were of my dad's generation, the World War II generation. And he had been like a sergeant or a platoon leader in World War II. And my dad was in World War II as well. And people who went through that war kind of had two different ways that they reacted. Some people, like my dad, just would never talk about their World War II experiences, ever. But then other people would talk about it a lot, and my Greek professor was of the latter sort, and he would illustrate his lecture sometime by making points from his World War II experiences. And I remember one time he was talking about they had a new 18-year-old kid in the unit, and they got into a firefight with the Germans. And this kid stands up and starts shooting at the Germans, not taking account of his own safety in the way that they do in the movies, and he wound up getting shot himself. Well, for Aristotle, courage is not total fearlessness. The kind of fearlessness that leads to foolhardiness. And in other words, Aristotle would have said, well, this kid's behavior is not virtuous. It's foolhardy. I mean, to just stand up there without cover and think you're not going to get shot. So, courage is not fearing nothing. But it also, of course, is not cowardice, fearing everything. But it's basically having fear but control it. And I mean, lots of times you see performers interviewed, or in the Olympics, you know, these world-class athletes will talk about having, you know, butterflies in their stomach before a performance or before to do their event. You know, I mean, they have some fear, but they control it and overcome it. And so for Aristotle, courageous behavior would be, you know, following the midpoint, having fear but controlling it, you know. Another example that I don't have in the slides is one of generosity. Now, I'm not much on astrology, but I am a Pisces, and supposedly Pisces are overly generous. We have the common sense cliche, he or she is generous to a fault, which recognizes that maybe you can be too generous, you know, give away too much and end up in financial straits yourself, right? So for generosity, you could be too generous, and that's for him a vice, not necessarily a virtue. But we all know on the other side that you know, Ebenezer Scrooge was not generous, right? And it's not being Scrooge either, you know. But generosity is giving in a sort of moderate, controlled way that's not over the top one way or another, you know. And there again, you know, he defines the virtue of generosity as a mean between, you know, being Scrooge or being too profligate with your money. So achieving the mean often requires, you know, behaving contrary to ways he liked to behave. And Aristotle and Plato both think that it's our reasoning abilities that enable us to walk this midway course. In other words, that we can control ourselves using our reasoning abilities. And that's how we achieve the mean. So, the Greeks, I mean, you know, these things have functions, right? You know, a calendar has a function, right? A pen, which many of you are using now, has a function, right, to be able to write on paper. A knife has a function, you know, to be able to cut something. And for Aristotle, very often, and if we had gone into his own metaphysical view, we would have seen this more, but we can't do everything. Very often, what a thing is essentially, its essential nature, is tied up with its unique function. In other words, the essential nature of a knife is tied up with its being an implement for cutting something. And the word virtue for the Greeks is not just moral goodness, but generally it means excellent. So being a good, you know, an excellent human being for Aristotle is developing these virtuous character traits. But the same word that's used for moral virtue in Greek can also be used for something performing its main function excellently. Now, if we were cooking something in my kitchen and I said, well, look, over there is a really virtuous knife. want you to hand me that knife over there. You look at me like I was from the moon, right? We don't talk that way. We don't talk about a virtuous knife, an inanimate object. But we do talk about a good knife, and we talk about moral goodness, so it's not so far. But the point is, the same word used for moral virtue is also used for an inanimate object that performs its function well. So a good knife is a virtuous knife in Greek. And the thing is, so human excellence is tied up for human beings then with performing their unique function well, their unique purpose. So what is the unique function or purpose of human beings? Well, for Aristotle, here's where reason comes into play. It has to be something that's unique to human nature, that's not that we don't share with other living things like plants and non-human animals, and that's what we have. There's a train performing its function well down there. It's funny. My dad, he was a carpenter, and we lived in Baltimore City. And right on the other side of the tracks is a place that in my dad's day was a hopping place when they didn't have all these other, places you could get lumber out in the county. And for my dad, that was the lumber yard. Oh, I'm going down to the lumber yard, get some stuff, he meant right down here. But now it's almost abandoned. Pardon? It's closed. Yeah, that's why I thought that they were open like a year or two ago, but yeah, it seemed like even the store isn't there anymore. Well, so for Aristotle, it's our reasoning abilities that set us in a unique category as human beings, and he's in line with a lot of other Greek thinkers who really place a strong emphasis on reason. And here's basically a diagram that tells you what was in the previous slide. In other words, he says, well, okay, just having biological functions, just having life, is not what makes us unique, right? Because we share biological functions with plants and with non-human animals. So go up the latter one, having the ability to feel pain and pleasure, having an emotional life, having awareness. Presumably plants don't have that, but non-human animals do. So having an emotional life, or what we call sentience, is nothing unique to human beings. We share that with non-human animals. Now, the notable exception to this was Descartes. Descartes had this view that our ability to feel emotions was part of our unseen, eternal, immortal soul, right? And he did not think that non-human animals had immortal souls. Well, if the ability to feel emotion is connected with your immortal soul and you don't have one, then it means as a non-human animal you don't feel pain and pleasure, don't have emotions. Now, you and I know that that's not true, right? If I accidentally step on my cat's tail or something like that, I guarantee it can feel pain and pleasure. And so, but for most philosophers, they would say, well, animals certainly do have an emotional life. But now if we look at reason, the ability to follow a reasoned argument, or the ability to support a belief we have by giving reasons why we hold that belief. The ability to live our lives, as Immanuel Kant later said in the 19th century, by following moral principles. For Aristotle, reason is where you can draw a sharp line between human beings and the rest of living things. Now, of course, after Darwin, that line's been blurred, right? In other words, for Aristotle, human reason is different in kind from any abilities that non-human animals would have. Whereas for Darwin, human reason is only different in degree from the reasoning abilities of, say, higher primates and border collies and dolphins. You know, like people who have that little sticker on their car, "My border collie is smarter than your honors student." Ever see that? They're supposed to be one of the most intelligent breed of dogs. But, you know, so after Darwin, it's become harder to draw this sharp line that the Greeks wanted to draw between human reasoning abilities and the reasoning abilities of other animals. But Aristotle thought that that was where we could. So, in other words, he said, well, we are essentially reasoning creatures. That's our chief function. And we use our reason to develop intellectual virtues by studying things theoretically. But also, he thought that our reasoning abilities were very important for our moral life. So what's the point of morality? Well, for Plato, it was trying to imitate goodness itself, an absolute standard for moral goodness that he thought was there in this other world, in the intellectual world. Now, for Aristotle, there is no intellectual world. Forms have no existence of their own apart from being in particular objects. You know, as we said before, for Plato, if the form of deskness went out of it, if all the desks went out of existence, the form of deskness would still be around. But for Aristotle, the only way there are forms of deskness is as they're embodied in particular desks. So if we got rid of all the particular desks, there wouldn't be any form of deskness around either. So if there is no separate realm where the forms exist, then there is no form of the good in this separate realm. So Aristotle has to look elsewhere for the chief end of ethics. What's it about? And for Aristotle, it's about having a happier, a better life here and now. The Greek word for that is eudaimonia, and it means more than just emotional, you know, oh, I'm happy, you know. But it's more feeling like your life is worthwhile. Yeah, you have your hand up?
No, she answered.
Pardon?
It's okay.
Okay. Well, what was your question? Oh, okay. So at any rate, if the question is why be moral, Aristotle's answer would be, well, living a moral life, a life where you try to cultivate the best virtues, is going to give you the happiest life as a human being. Now, we don't always agree with that. Some people think that the happiest life is one where you're going totally overboard. But that's not Aristotle's view. So happiness is the end of morality, and he calls it activity in accordance with virtue, but our virtue is to reason. So it's basically using our reasoning abilities to live a moderate life, is what, for Aristotle, is going to bring us the happiest life. Now, happiness for him is acting in accordance with virtue, to do noble and good deeds desirable for its own sake. Now, happiness as an ultimate standard, whatever your ultimate standard is, it has to be what's called intrinsically good. Not good because it produces some other good, but good in and of itself. And a good way to illustrate this is, somebody might say, well, it's good to eat healthy foods. And somebody says, well, why is it good to eat healthy foods? They say, well, if you eat healthy foods, you're going to be healthier and live longer. So you say, well, why would I want to generally be healthier and go through the trouble of doing that? And another thing somebody might say is, well, healthy people tend to have happier, more fulfilling lives. So doing these other things promotes happiness. But then if I went on to say, well, why is it good to be happy? For somebody like Aristotle, the buck stops there. Happiness is something that's desirable for its own sake alone, and not because it promotes some other good. And that's why it's the chief end or the chief good of morality, human happiness in this life. And again, happiness is more than just emotional, being on an emotional high. Eudaimonia is more, the happiness that comes with a feeling you're living a worthwhile, satisfying life, And so that for Aristotle is, the point of morality. So the happiest life then is walking the moderate mean between extremes and using your reason to do this, So the happiest life for him turns out to be a life of moderation. Any comments, questions? Where we're going to go next is we're going to look at a few topics in the philosophy of religion. And so I'm going to I think I've already made those PowerPoints on that visible to you. Something you might look at in supplemental readings is I've got a short selection on the design argument from William Paley. And Paley's very readable. This was written in like the early 1800s, 1802, and he has a very famous defense of the design argument. But that's, we're going to look at mostly the design argument and also another abstract one called the ontological argument. There's a PowerPoint that contains both of those on the website. Okay, well, take care and have a good weekend. And if anyone missed the roll when it was going around, just come up and sign it.
These are my accommodation papers.
Oh,
Your copy.
okay.
Front back, you know what it's for, right?
Oh, okay.
You know what that's for, right?
Okay, fill me in. I
My
don't
AAC,
recall
I don't
having.
take my tests in here. Well,
Okay.
I do, or
Oh,
I
all
don't
right.
take them with the class. I take them at different times. So we arrange different times for me to take it.
Okay. Okay.
And
Okay.
it has my accommodations.
Yeah, I have
That's fine right here.
this like at Essex too. So definitely keep me in the loop. Remind me that I need to do that. And probably the easiest thing to do would I usually spend a few hours in the afternoon in the office if you have the afternoons free, or could be early morning before class. You know, but we'll be able to you know work something out that.
Okay. Oh, man.
That'll work for you.
On the day.
Sure. And most people finish even though I give them the whole period, that's your pen. Most people finish within half an hour or 45 minutes. You know, so, okay. Pardon? Oh, okay. Yeah. I today I just passed around the roll, so if you just want to sign that and print your name, in case you write sloppy and hard to understand like I do, you know. Not too many people write. Let me make a note.